Hey guys, tonight we will draw back the curtain on history to explore a darker chapter that textbooks rarely dare to mention. Set aside the fairy tales and forget the familiar, tragic play about the war between the two houses. We are going to trace the footsteps of the White Rose, the House of York, a dynasty that carved its name onto the English throne with the most brutal of slashes, broken oaths, and battles that shook the very earth. This is not a dry historical account. This is the bare truth, where ambition devoured loyalty, where paranoia ruled the palace, and the terrifying violence made every fictional epic bow down. The beginning of this bloody chain of events stems from one man who never intended to seize the crown, but fate made his bloodline the fuse for a tragedy that spanned generations. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share a little about yourself. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? I love seeing which time zones our community is connecting from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the end of the 14th century, the English monarchy was plunged into a quiet but decisive upheaval. In the year 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, silently entered Westminster Abbey and crowned himself King Henry IV, without waiting for any formal succession ceremony or a battle to open the conflict. He immediately imprisoned Richard II, the reigning king, in the Tower of London, leaving the fate of his skip-generation cousin to court gossip. Some said Richard II starved to death, while others claimed he was quietly executed. No one knows the truth. The House of Lancaster, wielding military power and exploiting noble discontent, illegally seized the throne, inaugurating the reigns of 3 consecutive Lancaster kings: Henry IV, Henry V, the warrior king renowned in France, and finally Henry VI, who acceded to the throne at 9 months of age. Over the ensuing 6 decades, England descended into deep division. The Lancasters portrayed themselves as restorers of order, while the descendants of the rightful line felt the crown had been stolen. The White Rose was the emblem of the House of York, the legitimate branch descending from Lionel of Antwerp, second son of King Edward III. In medieval culture, the White Rose symbolized purity and divine right, in contrast to the Red Rose of the House of Lancaster. As tensions between the two families escalated into civil war, this emblem was affixed to Yorkist helmets, banners and shields, leading later generations to call the conflict the War of the Roses. The Yorkist descendants never forgot their exclusion. They witnessed the Lancastrian kings progressively diminish the glorious legacy of Edward III. From a powerful England standing alongside France and the Holy Roman Empire, the kingdom became fragmented, weakened, and riven by internal power struggles. Each Lancaster monarch endured his own trials. Henry IV quelled rebellions across the realm. Henry V achieved a celebrated French conquest but died young. And Henry VI, the child king, became a protectorate throne governed by a regency council of dukes and earls, with factional warfare poised to erupt. When Henry VI was crowned at 9 months old, the throne, like a candle flickering in a draught, was immediately besieged by the plots of rival factions. The Yorkists, bearing the White Rose emblem, gradually asserted themselves, winning the support of disaffected soldiers and nobles, and laying the groundwork for the bloody battles of the next decades. This was the backdrop and beginning of the White Rose dynasty you are about to explore. A saga of conflict between hereditary rights and military ambition, where every white and red rose was stained with blood on the fields of England. Henry VI grew up amid a maelstrom of faction and fear. The moment he inherited the crown on the 9th day of December in the year 1422, at the tender age of 9 months, he was immediately entrusted to a regency council of dukes and earls, each vying for supremacy. As he toddled between palaces, the once glorious gains of the 100 Years' War slipped away. By the year 1437, the French had reclaimed Normandy. By 1439, Rouen was lost. And by 1445, virtually all continental possessions won by his father, Henry V, had evaporated. England's treasury creaked under the strain, coinage debased, trade stalled, and the royal household struggled to pay its own servants, let alone the men-at-arms. The realm descended into paralytic disorder. Sheriffs no longer summoned juries, local courts fell silent, and roving bands of outlaws ravaged lonely villages. Magistrates shook their heads in despair as tax collectors rode empty-handed through the shires, returning home with nothing but tales of shuttered barns and shuttered hearts. Garrison commanders muttered in their mess halls, complaining of months without pay, and once loyal soldiers began to drift into the wilderness, joining those same bands of brigands that terrorized the highways. Henry himself was the last person equipped to restore order. Gentle and pious, he found greater solace on his knees than in an audience chamber. In the year 1439, he founded Eton College, a modest establishment by the Thames, to cultivate learned clerics and future statesmen. 3 years later, King's College, Cambridge, rose beside its ancient chapel, intended as a beacon of faith and scholarship. Yet in a land where steel bent wills, his compassion proved a liability. During the 1440s, Henry suffered repeated lapses of mind episodes chroniclers called fits of slumber. On more than one occasion, he lapsed into a catatonic state, mute and unseeing, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. In one frightful instance, his stupor endured for over a year. Courtiers whispered of a dreamless abyss, servants carried food to his motionless lips, and doctors consulted dusty tomes for remedies that never came. When he did awaken, he could not speak his own name, scarcely recognize his closest advisers, and occasionally wept without cause. Into this void strode Margaret of Anjou, a French princess of 15 summers, who arrived in England to marry the young king in the autumn of 1439. With a mind as sharp as a falcon's talon and a will honed in court intrigues, she took the reins of government. She convened the council, issued proclamations, marshalled forces to secure the northern marches, and fought tirelessly to defend the rights of her newborn son, Edward of Westminster. Yet as a foreign woman wielding power in a land steeped in male prerogative, she was met with suspicion and scorn. Nobles mocked her accent, accused her of poisoning princes, and hinted at treasonous designs. Under Margaret's stewardship, however, certain measures took root. Local garrisons were reinforced, and levies once neglected saw pay restored briefly. Still, the broader lawlessness persisted. Peasants bartered grain for protection. Civic militias formed to guard market towns, and every earl seemed to muster a private retinue. England had become a powder keg of resentment and ambition. Opposing Margaret stood Richard, Duke of York, a man of both noble blood and proven loyalty. A cousin to the king, he had earned his spurs in the fields of France, served as Lieutenant of Ireland, and amassed estates that brought him wealth sufficient to rival any peer. More importantly, his lineage traced through Lionel of Antwerp, second son of Edward III, giving him a claim cut from sterner cloth than that of Henry VI. Yet Richard said nothing of usurpation. He attended councils, obeyed royal commands, and raised no banner of rebellion. Instead, he worked subtly. From his castle in Cambridge to his strongholds in Yorkshire, he whispered of reform. He urged unpaid soldiers to join his retinues with promises of regular wages. He offered shelter to disaffected knights, who found in him a champion against the corruption paralyzing London and Westminster. Noblemen weary of Margaret's foreign influence flocked to his cause, and his estates swelled with recruits. Thus, as Henry VI oscillated between piety and paralysis, and as Margaret of Anjou carved out her regency amid jeers and whispers, Richard of York prepared for the moment when England would cry out for a stronger hand. In the hush before battle drums sounded, the stage was set for a confrontation not merely of armies, but of dynasties where white roses and red would spill their petals like blood upon the fields of a kingdom, desperate for deliverance. In the year 1455, King Henry VI suddenly lapsed into a profound and terrifying coma. He was found one morning unresponsive in his royal bedchamber, unable to speak, move, or recognize even his closest attendants. Panic gripped the court. The king, who had been crowned at 9 months of age, now lay inert, a fragile child enthroned but powerless. Faced with this crisis, the Regency Council, composed of dukes and earls vying for influence, had no choice but to appoint Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. In this role, Richard became the effective head of government, charged with safeguarding the kingdom until the king could recover. Richard arrived at Westminster with measured steps and a determined air, his retinue of loyal knights and clerks in tow. He opened the courts, long silent, and decreed that all pending legal cases be heard without delay. Lawyers and litigants streamed back to London's halls of justice, where disputes that had languished for months were finally resolved. Richard then ordered the collection of overdue taxes, directing sheriffs in each county to gather levies essential for the royal coffers. Under his watch, coin flowed once more into the exchequer, allowing wages to be paid to garrison troops and labourers alike. Next, he turned to military reforms. He reviewed muster rolls and reorganised the royal armies with an eye toward efficiency and discipline. Commanders received clear orders. Logistics channels were secured, and barracks in the northern marches were refurbished. Soldiers who had gone unpaid for seasons were at last remunerated, restoring morale among the ranks. Affairs that had teetered on the brink of anarchy began to settle. Regional lords who had drilled their own militias for private feuds now answered to a central authority. For the first time in months, the people of England could glimpse a return to order. Yet in Rouen and Sens, the French banners still flew, and Lancaster ships prowled the Channel coasts. But at least at home, the looming spectre of lawlessness had receded. England exhaled, believing its troubles might be tamed by a firm but fair hand. However, not everyone felt relief. Queen Margaret of Anjou, recently elevated to power by her marriage to Henry, fumed at Richard's ascendance. She had given birth to her son, Edward of Westminster, in the summer of 1453, and she saw in Richard's reforms a direct challenge to her own authority and to her boy's future claim. Margaret mobilised her adherents with urgent dispatch. She summoned her loyal lords and retainers to Windsor, rallying them with stirring appeals to family honour and to the sanctity of royal blood. When Henry's fever broke and he began to stir, Margaret moved swiftly to strip Richard of his protections. Through couriers and whispered propaganda, she accused the Duke of harbouring designs on the throne itself, painting him as a would-be usurper whose ambitions threatened both king and kingdom. She went so far as to circulate forged letters and exaggerate minor disputes into allegations of treason, intent on igniting fear among the nobility. Realizing that his life and position hung in the balance, Richard resolved that he could no longer stand idly by. He gathered 3,000 men, knights, archers, and men-at-arms drawn from his northern estates and his personal retinue, and set out for London in the month of May. He proclaimed his expedition a mission to rescue the king from corrupt counsellors, not a rebellion against the crown. Yet to the Lancastrian commanders, led by the indomitable Lord Somerset, Richard's march was unmistakably hostile. Somerset mobilised an army to intercept him, and the two forces converged on the small town of Street, Albans. The battle unfolded on the 16th day of May, in the narrow streets and alleyways that wound between timber-framed houses. Yorkist knights, armed with lances and bows, erected makeshift barricades of wagons and timber stakes at key choke points. From these positions they unleashed volleys of arrows into the faces of approaching Lancastrian pikemen. The enemy struggled to deploy en masse on the constricted thoroughfares. Somerset's men fell into disorder as Yorkist crossbowmen and billmen launched swift counterattacks. Within less than an hour, the clash was over. Lord Somerset himself fell beneath a Yorkist sword, and several prominent Lancastrian lords among them, the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Clifford, died where they stood. The collapsed armies scattered in disarray, trampled by panicked horses and harried by pursuing archers. In the midst of the rout, a stray arrow struck Henry VI in the shoulder as he rode with Somerset's banner, rendering him stunned and vulnerable. Yorkist squires bore him to safety, propping him upon his horse, and then escorting him under a white banner emblazoned with a red rose. Richard's men escorted the king back to London amid cheers, hailing him as the deliverer of England. At Westminster, Henry was received with reverence. The court buzzed with tales of the miraculous rescue. Yet behind the celebration lay a darker truth. With blood now spilled on London Bridge, the realm had crossed a threshold from political dispute into armed conflict. The victory at Street, Albans, swift though it was, revealed that force would decide England's fate, and so was born an open chapter of civil war, a grim prelude to the decades-long struggle known to history as the War of the Roses. In that moment, white petals and red petals alike lay trampled beneath the hooves of horses and stained in the mud with the blood of kinsman and noble. The silent corridors of power now echoed with the clang of steel. and the question that would haunt England for years to come was no longer who ruled by right, but who remained standing when the fields grew silent once more. In the wake of the first battle at Street, Albans, Richard of York assumed his role as Lord Protector with a grave sense of duty. He moved into the royal apartments at Westminster Palace in the latter part of the spring of the year 1455, and there set about restoring the mechanisms of governance. Under his watch, the courts of Chancery and Common Pleas reopened their doors by the 23rd day of May, after having been silent for months. Sheriffs and bailiffs across the shires received clear instructions to collect the overdue tallages and subsidies, and garrison commanders in the northern marches were finally paid their arrears. By midsummer, the Royal Exchequer reported a significant increase in receipts, enough at least to meet the costs of the Protector's household, and to resupply the king's levies with fresh arms and provisions. Yet far from succumbing to despair, Queen Margaret of Anjou viewed Richard's success with anger and trepidation. She had given birth to her son, Edward of Westminster, on the 13th day of October in the year 1453, and had guarded his prospects with implacable resolve. In her eyes, Richard's reforms symbolized an ever-growing eclipse of her own influence and that of her boy. Thus, throughout the winter and into the spring, Margaret sent emissaries to the northern earls, Percy of Northumberland, Neville of Warwick, and others, reminding them of their oaths to the Lancaster bloodline. She painted a portrait of Richard as an ambitious upstart, urging them to muster troops under the banner of the Red Rose to counter the Protector's White Rose. It was in the year 1456 that the drama reached its zenith. In the spring of that year, accounts vary between the months of April and May. King Henry VI suddenly stirred from his prolonged stupor. One morning he rose unsteadily from his bed, asked for his mother, and in a voice trembling with confusion named Margaret as his counsellor. This miraculous recovery sent shockwaves through the court. Those who had hailed Richard as saviour now recoiled at the thought of a restored Lancaster monarchy. Overnight, Margaret moved with decisive speed. She secured an audience with the freshly awakened king and implored him to revoke Richard's commission. By the first week of June, royal writs commanded all officers to deny the Protector the usual courtesies and to swear allegiance to Margaret's newly constituted council. Richard awoke one morning to find himself isolated. Courtiers who had once fawned upon him now spoke of his treacherous designs, citing letters that purportedly revealed his intention to depose the king a forgery. Most scholars agree, but one that carried the weight of a royal seal. In every corner of Westminster, accusations of treason flew like sparks in a dry wood. He was called a would-be tyrant, a violator of sacred vows, a stain upon the honour of all legitimate rule. The message was clear. If Richard did not submit, he and his heirs would be outlawed, their estates forfeit, their line extinguished. Faced with the prospect of arrest, trial, and possible execution, Richard could endure only so much. He convened his retainers at his lodgings in the Strand and addressed them in a voice weary but resolute. He reminded them of the lawlessness overtaking England, of the soldiers still unpaid in the northern garrisons, of the landlords overrun by bandits, and of the king himself once more imperilled by court intrigue. He framed his decision not as a bid for royalty but as a rescue mission. "We ride not to seize the crown," he told them, "but to save our king from the clutch of corrupt counsellors." Thus, in early June of 1456, Richard's banner once more caught wind as he led 3,000 armed men out of London. The march was swift but measured, designed to minimise harm to the countryside and to emphasise the Protector's claim of loyalty. Nonetheless, when his forces passed through Street, Albans on their way back to the capital, there were those who said the air crackled not with cries of "Long live the King," but with the drumbeats of civil war. Meanwhile, word of Richard's march lit a fire under the hearts of both noble and common folk. At market towns and manor houses, citizens declared they had grown weary of the endless cycle of favouritism and faction. They longed for a strong hand to restore England's honour, and perhaps to press once more into Normandy and Guienne. Merchants, tired of highwaymen, quietly pledged their allegiance to Richard's cause in exchange for promises of safe passage. Clergymen wrote homilies extolling the virtues of justice and the need for authority to protect the poor. For the first time in years, a sense of unity flickered among those who still looked to Westminster for leadership. Yet Richard, mindful of the delicate balance he had upset, refrained from crowning himself or making public pronouncements about succession. He bided his time in his apartments at Whitehall, directing the dispatch of letters to France, reminding King Charles VII of past alliances and of the need for calm across the Channel. He also negotiated with border lords in the Welsh Marches and the eastern counties, offering guarantees of their ancient privileges so long as they recognised the Protector's authority. Slowly, a coalition formed ranging from veteran knights to newly raised archers, bound by a shared desire to see England governed not by the whims of court gossip, but by clear laws and dependable leadership. Yet the path from Lord Protector to King remained fraught with pitfalls. Margaret of Anjou and her Lancastrian partisans, smouldering from their recent slight, continued to muster forces north of the Humber. They claimed descent from John of Gaunt, third son of Edward III, and proclaimed their son Edward of Westminster as the rightful heir. Foreign mercenaries whispered promises of French gold, and Scottish allies hovered along the border, ready to swoop in if England cracked. Thus, at the midpoint of the year 1456, England stood on a knife's edge. Richard of York, protector yet not king, had rallied the nation's hope for firm governance. Margaret of Anjou, queen yet not regent, had rallied nostrums of lineage and outrage. And Henry VI, king yet powerless, lingered in his chambers, caught between bouts of prayer and bouts of silence. The question that trembled on every lip was no longer whether England would be ruled, but by whom and when the first blade was drawn in earnest, whether red roses or white would bloom victorious on the blood-soaked fields that surely lay ahead. In the year 1460, Richard, Duke of York, resolved to take a bold and unprecedented step. He petitioned Parliament at Westminster to review and settle the question of royal succession once and for all. On the 3rd day of October in that year, he stood before the assembled Lords and Commons, presenting a meticulously detailed genealogy that traced his descent from Lionel of Antwerp, second son of King Edward III, through successive generations of his maternal lineage. He contrasted this with the Lancastrian claim, which derived from John of Gaunt, third son of Edward III, and offered to demonstrate, by charters and rolls, that his own bloodline was the senior right. His calm, measured voice echoed through the vaulted chamber as he laid out the principle that possession of the crown by legitimate birthright outweighed any usurpation by force. For weeks, the question consumed Parliament. Noblemen rose to debate, some invoking precedent from the reign of Richard II, others recalling the puritanical purges of Henry IV. The Speaker called for order, as peers exchanged impassioned arguments and clerks scurried to verify dates on ancient parchments. Outside Westminster Hall, citizens in muted grey and brown coats gathered to listen to heralds proclaim the progress of the debate, while the clang of hammers and the creak of wagons in the nearby market reminded all that life beyond politics carried on, albeit under a pall of uncertainty. Then, on the 14th day of October, the result was announced. Parliament had passed the Act of Accord. According to its terms, King Henry VI would retain his title and authority for the remainder of his natural life, but his infant son, Edward of Westminster, would be disinherited. Instead, upon Henry's death, the crown would pass not to Edward, but to Richard, Duke of York, and thereafter to his heirs. The Act of Accord sought to reconcile the two factions by compromise. Each would relinquish half of their claim in hopes of avoiding further bloodshed. Yet this accommodation failed to satisfy Queen Margaret of Anjou. In the bitter chill of December, Margaret marshalled her forces in the north. She arrived in York, accompanied by a throng of Lancastrian loyalists, including seasoned knights from Northumberland and Cumberland, and a contingent of Scottish allies sent by King James of Scotland. Her standard, a vivid red rose upon a field of crimson cloth, fluttered defiantly in the winter wind. With her rode banners of Lancaster, each demanding vengeance for the Act of Accord's perceived treachery. Richard awaited their advance at Sandal Castle, a sturdy fortalice overlooking the River Calder. He fortified the gates and ordered his retainers bowmen, billmen, and men-at-arms to hold the narrow causeways leading into the courtyard. On a snowy morning at the close of the year, the armies clashed on the frost-covered fields outside Wakefield. The Lancastrians, emboldened by their numerical superiority, estimated at 5,000 to 7,000 men surged forward against Richard's smaller force of perhaps 3,000. What followed was a rout and a massacre. The Yorkists, hemmed in by hedges and boggy ground, could not deploy their longbows effectively, and the thrust of Lancastrian spears and axes drove them back into confusion. Tradition holds that Richard fought bravely at the forefront, sword raised, rallying his men until he was overwhelmed. His second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, not yet 17 years old, rode at his father's side until both were cut down. Chroniclers record that Edmund was captured fleeing toward the town's bridge, and as merciless revenge for his father's deeds, was slain where he begged for mercy. Richard's own head was then severed and impaled on a pike, crowned with a paper circlet mocking his claim. The spectacle was displayed upon the walls of York, a gruesome symbol of Margaret's wrath. The defeat at Wakefield seemed to extinguish the House of York. Estates were seized, castles surrendered, and Yorkist nobles either fled into exile or laid down their arms. Yet even amid the smoke and ruin, one figure rose with indomitable resolve: Edward of York, the eldest son of Richard and Cecily Neville. At 18 years old, he was stationed on the Welsh border, honing his leadership among the Marcher lords. News of his father's death and the slaughter of his brother reached him in midwinter. Rather than despair, Edward felt a fire kindling within him. He gathered a modest retinue of loyal knights, perhaps 400 at first, and rode swiftly north, determined to redeem his family's honour. He issued a proclamation declaring himself not Lord Protector but King Edward IV, urging all true Englishmen to rally to his banner. On a field near Ferrybridge, he delivered his first victory when his small force surprised and routed a Lancastrian detachment, demonstrating both his martial skill and his uncanny ability to inspire confidence. Thus, even as winter winds howled across the devastated lands of Yorkshire, a new Yorkist hope emerged. Edward's youth, his imposing height well over 6 feet and his battlefield prowess convinced many that here was a leader capable of restoring stability, avenging Wakefield, and perhaps one day reclaiming Normandy. In the hush of those snowy days, as villagers shivered behind shuttered windows and clergy prayed for peace, the drumbeats of war sounded anew. The white rose had not been crushed. It had merely been replanted in firmer soil, awaiting the warmth of spring to bloom once more. After his father's crushing defeat at Wakefield, Edward of York, now styling himself King Edward IV, showed no sign of hesitation or despair. At 18 years of age, he moved with swift purpose to gather the remnants of his father's loyalists, rallying them beneath the banner of the White Rose. Drawing upon his household at Ludlow and the sympathies of Marcher lords along the Welsh border, he assembled a force of perhaps 400 men, knights, archers, and men-at-arms, each resolved to redeem the Yorkist cause. On the 2nd day of February, in the year 1461, Edward led this ragged band into Hertfordshire, where they encountered a larger Lancastrian contingent under the command of Ralph, Earl of Pembroke, acting on behalf of Margaret of Anjou. The Lancastrian force, numbering roughly 3,000, included Welsh foot soldiers eager to reconnect with the Queen's standard at York. They were marching north to reinforce Margaret's army, when Edward, seizing the initiative, chose to strike. The field of Mortimer's Cross lay just beyond the village of Wigmore, an expanse of stubbled barley marred by winter's frost. As dawn broke in piercing clarity, an atmospheric oddity occurred. 3 suns appeared in the pale sky, the phenomenon later identified by natural philosophers as a parhelion. To medieval eyes it seemed an ominous portent, and for a moment Lancastrian hearts faltered. Edward, sensing his moment, rode forth upon his steed, raised his helm, and proclaimed in a voice both gentle and urgent that the 3 suns symbolized the Holy Trinity favouring his cause. He cast aside fear, and his men did likewise, turning a dread omen into a divine assurance. With morale thus renewed, the Yorkists pressed the attack. They formed a line of longbows and bills behind a hastily erected hedge of stakes, while Edward himself led a charge against the Lancastrian right flank. The Welsh soldiers, taken aback by the boldness of the younger man's sword and shield, wavered under the weight of his assault. Once their ranks broke, Edward ordered a cavalry sweep, routing the enemy into the frozen furrows. Many Lancastrian prisoners were taken, among them Owen Tudor, a veteran soldier whose lineage would centuries later give rise to King Henry VII. In a grim echo of Wakefield's vengeance, Tudor was summarily executed on the field, his life forfeit in retribution for the deaths of Yorkist leaders. By early afternoon the battle was over. Fewer than 200 Yorkists had fallen, while Lancastrian casualties numbered in the hundreds estimates. range between 500 and 800 dead, with as many again wounded or captured. The victory at Mortimer's Cross was not merely tactical. It shattered the aura of invincibility that Margaret's forces had enjoyed since Wakefield. Edward's men spread the news through country lanes and market towns, and by the next day merchants and townsmen alike were singing his praises. Lord Mayor and aldermen of the City of London, anxious at reports of renewed Lancastrian advances, threw open the gates to Edward's banner. On the 4th day of March in the year 1461, he made his triumphant entry into the great Guildhall. Bedecked in robes of the deepest crimson and clad in chainmail beneath his surcoat, he was proclaimed King Edward IV by the assembled council and citizenry, though no formal coronation had yet taken place. Trombone and trumpet greeted him in the halls, and common folk lined the thoroughfares, lauding his bravery and deploring the suffering inflicted by the prior civil strife. In the days that followed, Edward issued proclamations restoring confiscated Yorkist estates and pardoning those who had served under the Lancastrian banner, provided they now pledged fealty to his crown. He ordered the repair of highways so that merchants could travel safely once more, and mandated that sheriffs resume regular tax collection to replenish the royal exchequer. He also sent emissaries to France, requesting a cessation of hostilities and peaceable passage for English merchants through Norman ports. Yet Edward did not rest on his laurels. He understood that a kingdom healed only in part could slip back into disorder. He maintained a standing bodyguard of 200 men wearing the white rose insignia, and convened a council of trusted Yorkists, among them his uncle Warwick, later known as the Kingmaker, to oversee the administration of justice. Together they arrested notorious bandit leaders who had thrived during the earlier chaos and re-established courts in York and Shrewsbury to handle local disputes. As winter's pale light yielded to the warmth of spring, rumours swirled that Margaret of Anjou was gathering a new army in Scotland and recruiting troops along the northeastern coast. Edward, strengthened by his recent triumph and buoyed by his reception at London, made ready to defend his hard-won authority. He rode out periodically with ragtag patrols of knights to show the flag in the Midlands and East Anglia, sending a clear message that no quarter would be given to those who challenged his rule. In the hush that settled over the land, as night descended and the candlelight flickered in thatched cottages, Edward's ascent offered a fragile promise of peace. Yet the legacy of Wakefield and Mortimer's Cross remained in every whisper, that in England's fate, force had become as decisive as law, and that the roses white for York and red for Lancaster would soon again entwine across the fields of a realm yearning for a true dawn of unity. Without waiting for any formal coronation, Edward moved swiftly to solidify his authority. In mid-February, Margaret of Anjou struck back. On the 17th day of February, 1561, she led a sizable Lancastrian force to a second victory at Street, Albans, routing a Yorkist garrison and rescuing King Henry VI from beneath Yorkist control to her own protection. Flush with triumph, she pressed south toward London, commanding an army of some 6,000 horse and foot, determined to reclaim the capital. Yet the city's gates remained firmly shut. On their walls, the Lord Mayor and the aldermen posted proclamations. No Lancastrian army would enter, lest our streets be stained with the blood of our own citizens. Unable to besiege London before Edward's return, Margaret had no choice but to withdraw northward to safeguard her power base in Yorkshire. Edward seized the moment. He rode out from London at dawn on the 20th day of February, his retinue bolstered by reinforcements from the home counties and East Anglia, where merchants and landowners had pledged their support after hearing word of Mortimer's Cross. Banners bearing the white rose fluttered in the wind as the army of roughly 4,000 Yorkist horse and foot marched toward the north. The momentum of his cause, combined with the city's blessing, made Edward's advance appear unstoppable. By the 1st of March, Edward's force reached Ferrybridge, where he paused to rest and resupply. On the 4th day of March, he rode triumphantly through the streets of London, welcomed by cheering crowds in the Guildhall and on Cheapside. The Lord Mayor formally declared him King Edward IV, though no sanctified crown had yet been placed upon his head. Knights, merchants and commoners alike hailed him as the saviour of the realm, trusting that under his rule taxes would be levied fairly and trade routes secured once more. Within days, Edward pushed northward, intent on ending Lancastrian resistance in a single decisive blow. His cavalry swept ahead, and his archers took up positions behind natural hedgerows and low walls, ready to unleash volleys into any Lancastrian force that dared oppose him. On the 29th day of March, 1561, the feast of Palm Sunday, the two armies met in a desolate tract of Yorkshire countryside, near the village of Towton. Local tradition held that nearly 30,000 souls perished in that single day's fighting, making Towton the bloodiest battle ever witnessed on English soil. A freezing blizzard roared across the plateau as dawn broke. Snow fell so thickly that visibility dropped to mere yards, and the biting wind stung every exposed face. Edward ordered his archers to fire into the wind. The arrows, carried further by the gale, rained down upon the Lancastrians who, lacking similar tactical foresight, struggled to return fire effectively. Men-at-arms fell by the thousands. Those who survived the initial barrage found themselves pressed by charges of Yorkist cavalry wielding lances at full tilt. The sight of red-stained snow, terse copies of ice, turned crimson by fallen blood, sent waves of panic through the Lancastrian ranks. Soldiers attempting to flee were cut down in the churned fields. Horses stumbled in drifts, trampling the wounded beneath them. Edward, astride a steed of polished black, rode along the lines, exhorting his men in a calm yet commanding voice. "Stand firm in God's name," he called, "and fear no blade that strikes for liberty." His personal bravery exposed head, visor raised, sword glinting galvanized the Yorkists, while the Lancastrians faltered. By late afternoon, the Lancastrian force had collapsed. Survivors streamed toward the River Went, hoping to swim to safety, but icy currents and the weight of armor claimed many lives. Contemporary chroniclers described the banks as littered with bodies so dense that the water's surface could be crossed without leaving a single drop wet. The few who reached the opposite shore were captured by Yorkist patrols and summarily executed, leaving little hope for Yorkist clemency. Edward's casualties, by comparison, were remarkably light. Estimates range between 2,000 and 3,000 dead and wounded, but the price of victory still weighed heavily on him. As dusk fell, he surveyed the devastated field. The wind had eased, and under the rising moon, the stain of conflict lay stark on the snow. He ordered a halt to further pursuit, directing his men instead to gather the slain and tend to the wounded. Field surgeons, summoned from nearby towns, pitched hastily constructed tents. Monks from distant abbeys trudged through the mud to administer last rites. For Edward, this was not a day of triumph alone, but a solemn reckoning with the cost of war. With Towton secured, Edward IV effectively controlled the entirety of England. Lancastrian resistance in the north all but evaporated, towns quickly submitted, and castles that once bristled with swords opened their gates rather than face the same fate. He dispatched envoys to border lords in Cornwall, Kent and Suffolk, demanding their fealty and offering pardons to those who swore loyalty before the end of April. The exchequer, replenished by loans from London bankers and seized Lancastrian estates, began issuing monthly wages once more. By mid-April, Edward's hold on the throne was unassailable. He convened a council at Westminster to draft ordinances aimed at preventing future outbreaks of factional violence. Among these was an act requiring all nobles to swear a bond of allegiance annually, under penalty of forfeiture. He also restored city charters and reaffirmed common law rights to calm townspeople who had suffered in the conflict's wake. At last, King Edward IV looked upon his kingdom and saw that, for the moment at least, it was indeed his to govern, a testament to a victory as decisive as it was brutal, and a prelude to the uneasy peace that would follow the War of the Roses' most cataclysmic day. On the 28th day of June, Edward IV entered Westminster Abbey with all the solemnity and pageantry befitting a king newly crowned. The vaulted ceilings rang with the chants of the clergy as the Archbishop anointed him with holy oil, first on the right shoulder, then on the left, before placing Street Edward's crown upon his head. This sacred rite signified not merely popular acclaim, but the Church's blessing and the formal recognition of his rule by the realm's most powerful nobles. No sooner had the rituals of coronation concluded than Edward set about securing his throne. Within days he ordered the arrest of prominent Lancastrian conspirators, men who had joined Queen Margaret's cause or plotted in shadowy councils. Among them was the Earl of Northumberland, taken in Durham and swiftly tried for treason. Found guilty, he was beheaded on Tower Hill, his estates forfeit to the crown. Lord Clifford, another fierce opponent, was captured near Pontefract and suffered the same fate, his lands and titles stripped and handed over to Yorkist loyalists. Simultaneously, Edward dispatched commissioners throughout the North and Midlands to catalogue the holdings of those deemed traitors. Hundreds of manors changed hands. The confiscated lands of rebels were parcelled out to knights and gentry who had remained true. In York itself, the former seat of Lancastrian power, the chapter house at York Minster was repurposed to store records of these transfers, a daily reminder that rebellion carried a heavy price. To reward his soldiers, Edward ordered that each man-at-arms who had served under his banner at Towton receive a grant of 30 acres of confiscated pasture, plus a one-time payment of £10. Archers were allotted parcels of woodland sufficient to produce longbow staves, and sergeants received modest sums, 5 marks, to set themselves up in trades or small farms. These distributions, carefully recorded by the Exchequer, cost the Crown an estimated £2,000, but secured the loyalty of the very men who had risked their lives on the field of battle. Edward then turned his attention to the kingdom's finances at large. He revived the system of farmed revenues, contracting the collection of customs and the milder subsidies for fixed sums paid in advance, which had fallen into disuse under the Lancastrians. Sheriffs were ordered to remit quarterly accounts rather than annual ones, allowing for more timely replenishment of the royal treasury. In London, he reopened the mint at the Tower, commissioning new coinage stamped with his profile and the motto Dominus Principium, the Lord is first, intended both to stabilise the currency and to reinforce his sovereign image. At the same time, Edward convened a great council at Westminster, summoning dukes and earls from across the realm. He pledged to uphold the charters granted by his predecessors, ensuring towns their ancient rights to self-governance and to free markets. He also confirmed the liberties of the universities at Oxford and Cambridge, guaranteeing students safe passage to lecture halls without fear of conscription into private militias. Despite these efforts, reconciliation between Yorkist and Lancastrian factions proved elusive. In the autumn of Edward's first regnal year, he proposed a marriage alliance. His own sister, Princess Cecily, was to wed Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster. The plan, brokered by envoys in Calais, aimed to bind the two families by blood, and thus to quell the lingering hatred. Margaret, however, refused to consent unless the Act of Accord was overturned, an impossible demand. Undeterred, Edward sought to maintain a semblance of unity by retaining several moderate Lancastrians in minor offices. A stewardship here, a justice of the peace there, posts that carried neither great power nor significant revenue, but that demonstrated his willingness to forgive old divisions. He hoped that by showing mercy to those who had erred, he might coax them back into loyal service. Yet beyond the confines of London and its environs, Margaret of Anjou continued her efforts to regroup. She retreated to her strongholds in Yorkshire, where she negotiated with the King of Scotland to dispatch troops across the border, promising them rich spoils and grants of English lands once the Red Rose was triumphant. In Wales, she cultivated alliances with marcher lords, trading future favour for present support. Messages bearing the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster fluttered across the Pennines, each heralding a different vision for England's future. By the close of the year, Edward recognised that political conciliation alone would not suffice. His brother-in-law, the Earl of Warwick, the famed Kingmaker, warned that pockets of Lancastrian resistance remained in the north and in the Welsh hills. Should these embers of rebellion flare again, they could threaten all that had been won at Mortimer's Cross and Towton. Accordingly, Edward began to forge a broader alliance, extending invitations to loyal knights in the Midlands, promising new lands to West Country barons, and reassuring coastal towns that the Royal Navy's harbour masters would protect their ships from pirate raids. He elevated trusted Yorkist lieutenants to positions of authority in the shires, creating a network of deputy sheriffs and justices beholden directly to his crown. In the candlelit corridors of Westminster, as winter settled over the kingdom and the wind howled outside, Edward IV understood that his coronation was but the opening act of a longer drama. To secure the White Rose's dominance, he would need both the iron of his sword arm and the velvet of his mercy. Only then could the fragile peace he had forged after the carnage of Towton endure, keeping at bay the return of civil war's dark spectre. Margaret of Anjou remained unbowed. Firm in her resolve, she withdrew northward with her young son, Edward of Westminster, and established her base at Bamborough Castle, perched high on its rocky crag above the North Sea. From there, she maintained secret correspondence with her allies in Scotland, Envoys slipped across the border under cover of darkness, bearing letters sealed with the red rose, promising that Scottish reinforcements would soon arrive on the coast of Northumberland. Margaret dispatched messengers to call up retainers among the northern earls and to rally bands of foot soldiers in the Dales, any who would fight under Lancaster's standard against the usurper to the south. Meanwhile, in London and at court, King Edward IV entrusted the North's affairs to his closest confidant, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who already bore the sobriquet the Kingmaker. Warwick was among the realm's wealthiest and most powerful nobles, his estates sprawling across Yorkshire and Warwickshire. He possessed a rare combination of diplomatic finesse and military acumen. Edward charged him with two critical tasks: to parley with potential Scottish invaders and to muster sufficient troops from Lancastrian held territories to counter Margaret's levies. By the autumn of the year 1463, Warwick had completed the diplomatic groundwork. He negotiated a temporary truce with King James II of Scotland, offering to withdraw Yorkist garrisons from the borders in exchange for assurances that no Scottish troops would land to reinforce Lancaster. At the same time, he recruited contingents from Cheshire and Shropshire, raising a force of roughly 4,000 men. These were drawn from local levies, mercenaries discharged by the Crown, and hardened veterans of Mortimer's Cross and Towton. On the 15th day of May, in the year 1464, Warwick's army approached Bamborough Castle. His scouts reported a Lancastrian force of perhaps 2,500, many of whom were raw recruits hastily gathered from the surrounding countryside. The Lancastrians, confident in their numerical superiority, arrayed themselves on rising ground near the village of Hexham. They believed that Edward of Westminster, now aged 10, would inspire them to a decisive stand. Warwick, ever the tactician, chose to strike before dawn. On the morning of battle, his cavalry occupied Douce's Field, cutting off the Lancaster army's line of retreat to the west. He ordered his infantry to hold the main road while his archers deployed on the flanks, ready to deliver volleys into the exposed ranks of the enemy. Behind the archers, billmen and men-at-arms waited in silence, steel glinting in the pale spring sunlight. Shortly after sunrise, the signal was given. Warwick's archers unleashed a storm of arrows that shattered the Lancastrian formation. The inexperienced foot soldiers faltered, and the dust-choked air filled with the sound of twanging bows and panicked cries. Seizing the moment, Warwick's cavalry thundered forward in wedge formations, their lances aimed at the gaps in the enemy line. The Lancashire soldiers, unable to stand the onslaught, broke ranks and fled in panic. In less than 2 hours, the battle was concluded. Lancastrian casualties were heavy estimates range between 500 and 1,000 dead, with as many again taken prisoner. Among the prisoners was the young Edward of Westminster himself. Captured while seeking concealment in a nearby farmhouse, the boy prince was brought before Warwick under guard. In a solemn council held at Hexham Priory that afternoon, the charges of treason were read aloud. Found guilty of raising arms against the Crown, Edward of Westminster was sentenced to death. At sunset, his sentence was carried out on the Priory Green, a tragic footnote to a conflict defined by its brutality. Margaret, who had only hours before watched her son's forces routed, fled northward towards Scotland. She abandoned Bamborough Castle under cover of darkness and crossed the Tweed into exile. There she sought haven first in Edinburgh, then in France, where she appealed to King Louis XI for support, promising in return the restoration of English possessions on the continent. Yet her pleas fell on wary ears. France's coffers were strained, and the recent resumption of war with Burgundy left little gold for foreign ventures. In England, Warwick's victory at Hexham extinguished Lancastrian resistance on home soil for the moment. Edward IV's position was secure. No rival army remained on British territory to contest his rule. He rode north 2 days later, entering York amid triumphant cheers. The city's citizens, many of whom had before bowed to Lancaster banners, now lined the streets in white and blue, offering bread and ale to the victors. Edward issued a general pardon to those who had marched under Margaret's flag, on condition they took new oaths of loyalty by midsummer. Meanwhile, Warwick received a peerage grant, Earl of March, reinforcing his holdings across the north. He was confirmed as the King's lieutenant in both Wales and the northern marches, giving him autonomous command to suppress any lingering unrest. His success at Hexham, one of the swiftest and most decisive battles of the War of the Roses, cemented his reputation as the architect of Yorkist supremacy, the true kingmaker behind Edward IV's throne. Yet the realm remained fragile. Margaret's son, though dead, had become a martyr for Lancastrian sympathisers. In France and Scotland, whispers circulated of renewed plots, and scattered bands of Lancastrian exiles lingered on the coasts, ready to exploit any sign of Yorkist weakness. Edward IV, aware that peace was not guaranteed by a single victory, continued to rely on Warwick's counsel and on cautious alliances across the realm. Together, they laboured to weave a lasting peace, one that might at last allow England to heal from the terrible wounds inflicted by decades of dynastic strife. In the years following Towton, King Edward IV's confidence swelled with each successive victory. Yet triumph bred a certain arrogance. He began to regard his closest allies as mere instruments, most notably Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known far and wide as the Kingmaker. Warwick had raised armies, negotiated treaties, and even chosen which battles to fight, all in Edward's name. In return, the Earl expected payment of debts, grants of land, and prestigious offices. But Edward, flush with victory, and convinced of his own indispensability, delayed repayment and withheld several key titles. Resentment grew in Warwick's heart. He watched as the king elevated new favourites, men of lesser lineage, into the highest ranks of the royal household. He saw his own revenues diminished when Edward granted lucrative positions to those who had only recently emerged from obscurity. By the spring of the year 1469, Warwick's displeasure had reached a fever pitch. He met with other discontented lords, including his brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had long felt slighted by Edward's favouritism. Together, they plotted a dramatic turn against the very king they had placed on the throne. In mid-July of 1469, Warwick's supporters secretly seized the Tower of London. His retainers, disguised as palace guards, overpowered the small detachment loyal to Edward and took the young king himself into custody. Edward was confined within a chamber of the royal residence, under guard, while Warwick stepped forward to proclaim a new order. He declared that Edward's reign had become harmful to the realm, and that his brother, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, would henceforth reign in his stead. Clarence, astonished yet eager, was crowned at Westminster on the 27th day of July, before a select assembly of peers and prelates. Yet the broader nobility and common citizens reacted with near universal contempt. Clarence lacked Edward's martial reputation, charisma, and proven leadership. Londoners refused to lower their banners. Merchants would not bow before an untested duke. Even in the countryside, local gentry held their gates shut against Warwick's summons. Without popular or aristocratic support, Clarence's brief reign foundered within days. Seeing the wavering loyalty of his subjects, Warwick realized that his experiment had failed. Secret envoys slipped into Clarence's chamber, urging him to persuade his brother to abdicate. Clarence did so on the 30th day of July, renouncing the crown and restoring Edward IV to liberty. Warwick, recognizing the depth of miscalculation, withdrew his men quietly, hoping to avoid a wider conflict. By the first week of August 1469, Edward IV had reclaimed his throne. With uncharacteristic generosity, he pardoned many of Warwick's followers, yet confiscated key estates from the Earl himself. Warwick was stripped of the title of Captain of Calais and removed from the King's Council. In his place, Edward restored trusted Yorkist loyalists, including his Chancellor and his Master of the Horse. Order returned, at least on the surface, and the kingdom breathed a collective sigh of relief. However, the fracture between king and kingmaker left deeper fault lines. Disaffected Yorkist knights, feeling betrayed by both Edward and Warwick, began to conspire anew. In the Welsh marches and the northern dales, small bands of rebels, many veterans of earlier battles, took up arms against royal garrisons. Edward was compelled to dispatch detachments of men-at-arms and archers to suppress these insurrections, often quartering them in local abbeys to maintain discipline. He moved with caution, balancing harsh reprisals, executions of ringleaders by hanging, drawing and quartering, with offers of pardons to those who laid down their weapons. Meanwhile, in exile, the Lancastrian cause found fresh leadership in Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. A young man of Breton upbringing, descended through the female line from John of Gaunt, Henry Tudor bided his time in Brittany and then in France. He cultivated contacts among disillusioned English exiles and veteran soldiers of earlier Lancaster armies. Covertly, he arranged for ships and mercenary bands to gather on the Normandy coast, planning an invasion when conditions in England proved favourable. Despite Edward's victory over Warwick's revolt, these Lancastrian plots posed a constant threat. Each autumn, as winds increased and seas calmed, Tudor's envoys slipped across the Channel with promises of French gold and Catholic sympathy. English traders passing through Calais heard rumours of a coming landing, and coastal watchmen reported suspicious vessels offshore. Edward responded by reinforcing coastal fortifications in Kent and Cornwall, and by ordering the navy to patrol the Channel more aggressively. The resulting pattern of unrest Yorkist rebels in the north, Lancastrian exiles abroad kept England in a tense equilibrium. Edward's health, once robust, began to suffer under the strain of constant vigilance. He relied increasingly on his brothers George and Richard of Gloucester to manage day-to-day governance. Parliament granted him extraordinary subsidies to fund standing armies and naval patrols, even as the king sought to reduce taxes on merchants to stimulate trade. Throughout these tumultuous years, Edward IV's ascension, after the Battle of Towton and his initial alliance with Warwick, had laid the groundwork for a Yorkist hegemony that would dominate the mid-15th century. His diplomatic marriages, grants of land to loyal supporters, and reforms of royal finances created a fragile but resilient framework of support. Yet the quarrel with his most powerful noble underscored a fundamental lesson. In a realm riven by dynastic strife, even a king's closest companion could become his gravest threat. As the decade of the 1460s drew to a close, the War of the Roses remained far from concluded. Edward IV's restoration had secured a decade of relative Yorkist ascendance, but the divided loyalties of the nobility and the lurking figure of Henry Tudor indicated that the final chapters of England's civil war were still unwritten. Only time would tell whether the White Rose would finally bloom unchallenged, or once again be trampled underfoot by the rival Red Rose of Lancaster. In the wake of Warwick's failed revolt at the close of the year 1469, Edward IV turned his attention to the machinery of government itself. He began by purging crown offices of Lancastrian partisans. Within weeks, judges, sheriffs, and revenue collectors known to have supported Margaret of Anjou's cause were summarily dismissed. In their place, Edward elevated a new cadre of loyalists, particularly younger members of the Neville family, nephews of his erstwhile ally Warwick, into key posts. Commissioners in Yorkshire, Worcestershire, and Gloucestershire saw their tenures abruptly cut short. New appointees arrived to assert royal authority and to prevent entrenched local magnates from building independent power bases. Alongside these personnel changes, Edward reformed the kingdom's courts. The Court of Chancery was streamlined, with its backlog of petitions reduced by nearly 50% within 6 months, according to surviving Exchequer records. Even more significantly, the Star Chamber was empowered to adjudicate cases of corruption and sedition. Edward dispatched mandates across the shires, ordering that any royal official accused of malfeasance be brought before Star Chamber within 30 days, far swifter than the old assize circuits. This dual approach both deterred would-be conspirators and demonstrated that justice could no longer be bought or delayed through influence. Meanwhile, the king fortified the royal coffers, recognizing that customs duties on wool, England's principal export, had lapsed into lax collection. Edward resurrected a system of bonded farms for the Port of London and the Cinque Ports. His agents negotiated fixed annual payments on behalf of merchants, while quarterly audits ensured compliance. Grain tithes, too, were revalued according to the latest manorial surveys, securing a reliable source of income to feed and clothe the standing army. By the year 1473, customs income had risen by nearly 20%, enabling Edward to commit to long-term garrisons along the Scottish and Welsh borders without imposing new levies on his subjects. On the diplomatic front, Edward IV shifted from aggression toward consolidation. He opened negotiations with King Louis XI of France, culminating in the Treaty of Picquigny, signed on the 29th day of August in the year 1475. Under its terms, Louis agreed to pay 75,000 écus annually to Edward, in exchange for the withdrawal of English forces from Picardy and Normandy. This arrangement not only brought a substantial infusion of gold into the royal treasury, but also freed Edward from costly continental campaigns. He used the treaty monies to underwrite domestic projects, repairing the Great North Road, strengthening the walls of York and Canterbury, constructing stone bridges across the Trent and Avon, and dredging the canals around the Somerset levels to improve drainage. These public works sparked a revival in internal commerce. Market tolls in the Midlands grew by nearly 15% over a 3-year span, while wool exports through the Port of London increased by 10%. Merchants credited the improved roads for reduced transport costs, and agricultural tenants benefited from newly drained fields. The economic upturn bolstered Edward's popularity at home, even as his courts and armies remained vigilant against threats abroad. One such threat materialized in the spring of the year 1471. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond and Lancaster's last surviving claimant, landed at Milford Haven in South Wales on the 28th day of April. Tudor rallied local Welsh clans and remnant Lancastrian sympathisers, swiftly seizing Carmarthen Castle. His force, estimated at fewer than 700 men, included a handful of Breton exiles and veteran knights. The capture of Carmarthen sent shockwaves through Edward's court, as whispers of a revived Lancastrian uprising reached Whitehall. Edward responded without delay. He recalled veteran regiments stationed in Flanders, numbering nearly 2,000 men-at-arms and archers, and placed them under the command of the Duke of Gloucester, his younger brother. By the end of May, the Yorkist contingent crossed the Channel and landed at Milford Haven. Edward himself arrived 2 days later to take personal command, mustering local levies and forging alliances with border lords in the Welsh marches. The decisive engagement came near Mortimer's Cross, not the same field as Edward's earlier victory, but a site equally strategic near the border of Herefordshire. Tudor's force, hampered by inadequate cavalry and wearied by long marches, found itself outmanoeuvred by the disciplined Yorkist men-at-arms. Under the morning mist on the 9th day of June, the Yorkist archers unleashed a devastating hail of arrows, while Gloucester's lancers executed pincer movements that split the Lancastrian line. Tudor's men broke and fled into the surrounding woods. Those captured were executed summarily, save for the Earl himself, who slipped away in the confusion. Henry Tudor escaped across the Irish Sea to seek refuge in Dublin and then sailed on to Brittany, where he renewed his petitions to Duke Francis II. His defeat, however, ended the immediate threat to Edward's reign. With no rival army active in England, Edward IV could claim that the Yorkist dynasty was firmly established. In the years that followed, he deepened his alliances with Flanders, expanding English wool exports to Bruges and Ghent, and invested in the Royal Navy, commissioning new cogs and carracks to protect merchant convoys. These maritime foundations would, in the century ahead, propel England toward its destiny as a dominant naval power. Through administrative purges, legal reforms, diplomatic settlements, and decisive military action, Edward IV transformed a kingdom ravaged by civil war into one poised for prosperity. Yet the century's end would show that dynastic rivalries remain ineradicable. Though Edward secured Yorkist rule through the 1460s and 70s, the roses of Lancaster and York would continue to vie for England's crown each blossom. A reminder that peace, once won, must be vigilantly maintained. From the middle of the decade of 1470, life at Edward IV's court began to blossom with a new sense of refinement and pageantry. The king sought to cultivate an image of the wise and gentle monarch, opening his palaces to lavish entertainments designed to draw noble attention away from feud and faction. At Westminster and at Eltham, great banquet halls were hung with tapestries. Crystal chandeliers glimmered by candlelight, and musicians played the lute, viol, and harp. Twice each year at Candlemas in February, and again at Michaelmas in September, Edward staged masked processions, or masques, featuring allegorical figures and elaborate costumes. Nobles danced the pavane and galliard, their courtiers wearing velvet and silk of the richest hues. Foreign envoys from Burgundy, Castile, and France marvelled at the sumptuous displays, reporting back that England's court had at last reclaimed the sophistication it had lost during the reign of Henry VI. At the same time, Edward IV took measures to ensure his person and his family would never again be left vulnerable to palace coup or ambush. Early in 1485, he authorised the formal creation of the Yeomen of the Guard, the first permanent royal bodyguard in English history. Selected from the king's most trusted archers and men-at-arms, each yeoman underwent rigorous training in the use of sword and crossbow. They swore an oath to defend the king's person against all traitors, usurpers, and assassins, and were quartered within the royal apartments themselves. Clad in uniforms of crimson and gold bearing the white rose, the Yeomen of the Guard became both a potent symbol of royal authority and a practical deterrent to any would-be conspirator seeking to penetrate the palace gates. Meanwhile, Edward IV advanced a subtle but far-reaching foreign policy, seeking friends and alliances across the European continent. He maintained cordial relations with Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy, whose duchy controlled vital trade routes to the Low Countries. In 1474, at Edward's urging, his sister Bridget, Abbess of Barking, hosted Burgundian envoys, who negotiated favourable terms for English cloth merchants. That same year, Edward fostered ties with the Catholic monarchs of Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, arranging for his niece Elizabeth of York to be considered as a potential bride for Prince John of Castile, a match devised to strengthen England's position at the Mediterranean ports. Though neither marriage came to pass, the negotiations signalled Edward's ambition to secure England's place in the dance of dynastic alliances. Closer to home, Edward granted privileges to his merchants in Antwerp. In 1475, he signed letters patent, allowing English traders to settle in the city's merchant quarter and to pay reduced customs duties on wool exports. By negotiating these exemptions directly with the magistrates of Antwerp, Edward empowered his subjects to compete with the powerful Hanseatic League. Over the next 3 years, English wool exports to the Low Countries rose by an estimated 20%, enhancing the prosperity of Suffolk and Norfolk shepherds and swelling royal customs revenues. Yet amid these triumphs, Edward faced a test of resolve within his own family. His younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, once a steadfast Yorkist, had twice rebelled, then pleaded for forgiveness. By the year 1478, rumours abounded that Clarence had plotted anew, angling to supplant Edward and restore Lancastrian influence. Accusations flew that he had taken bribes from foreign merchants, conspired with disaffected nobles, and even offered to restore Henry Tudor to a share of the throne in exchange for riches. Edward, determined to demonstrate that no relation, however close, could evade justice, brought Clarence before the Star Chamber in February of 1478. The trial, held within the Painted Chamber at Westminster, lasted but a single day. Witnesses testified to Clarence's secret correspondence with exiled Lancastrians, and the Duke's own dismissive answers sealed his fate. Convicted of high treason, Clarence was sentenced to die by the full penalty, a form of execution that combined hanging, drawing, and quartering. Yet in deference to royal blood, Edward commuted the manner of his death. On the 9th day of February, Clarence was taken to Tower Green, where he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, an act that quickly became known as the Brothers' Cup. Clarence's demise sent shockwaves through the nobility. It underscored that Edward IV, though generous in peace, would show no mercy to those who threatened the realm's stability even if they bore the Plantagenet name. Many peers, witnessing Clarence's fate, fell into line, anxious to avoid a similar end. The message was clear. Loyalty was rewarded, but betrayal would not be tolerated. By the close of the 1470s, Edward IV's rule was characterized by both opulence and firmness. His court had regained its lustre. His foreign alliances expanded England's commercial reach, and his legal reforms, including the empowerment of the Star Chamber, had reined in corruption. The creation of the Yeomen of the Guard provided a visible reminder that the king's security was paramount. Yet the execution of Clarence taught all that the peace enjoyed under Yorkist governance rested on a foundation of disciplined authority. In candlelit corridors and in the hush of cathedral choirs, the echoes of jingling swords and whispered oaths spoke of a kingdom reborn buoyant with prosperity, yet anchored in the strictest measure of justice. In the year 1483, a sudden and severe illness struck King Edward IV, and on the 9th day of April, he breathed his last at Westminster Palace. His unexpected death plunged the realm into an immediate crisis of succession. The king's eldest son, Prince Edward, born on the 2nd day of November in the year 1470, was only 12 years old, far too young to bear the burdens of sovereignty. His younger brother, Prince Richard of York, was yet more vulnerable at 9 years of age. In the days following the king's passing, both boys were escorted under heavy guard to the Tower of London. They were entrusted to the care of their maternal grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Bedford, as well as to the protection of Elizabeth Woodville, their aunt, and Lord Hastings, a loyal counsellor whose banner still flew in favour of the young princes. Yet even as solemn prayers echoed in the abbey, another figure moved swiftly to seize power. Richard Neville, Duke of Gloucester and brother to the late Queen, leveraged his position as Lord Protector of the realm. He cited a little-known provision of royal law. that no marriage contracted without the formal consent of the council could produce legitimate heirs. Since Edward IV's union with Elizabeth Woodville had been arranged in private, Gloucester argued, Prince Edward automatically forfeited his claim to the throne. Many in the nobility found the rationale dubious, but Gloucester's grasp on the corridors of power was firm. On the first day of June, Gloucester presented himself before the assembled Lords Spiritual and Temporal at Westminster Hall. In a dramatic session that stretched from morn until dusk, he laid bare his case. The late king had been misled by improper counsel, and the realm required a ruler of sound mind and legitimate blood. He then escorted young Richard of York from the Tower to the palace, presenting him as proof of Gloucester's peerless loyalty to the royal line. The assembly, wearied by recent turbulence and persuaded by Gloucester's forceful oratory, concurred that the elder prince was legally disinherited. Thus, on the 25th day of June 1483, a formal proclamation was read in London's public squares. Richard Plantagenet, Duke of Gloucester, would henceforth reign as King Richard III. On the very next day, the 26th of June, Gloucester was anointed and crowned within the venerable walls of Westminster Abbey. His coronation, stripped of the usual pageantry and conducted before a select gathering of lords, marked what many later chroniclers would call England's first legal coup, a bloodless overthrow sanctioned by Parliament yet achieved through the subtlest of machinations. The reaction among the populace and the peerage was one of incredulity and alarm. London's guilds draped no banners of celebration in Cheapside, and the customary firework displays were conspicuously absent. In the northern counties and the shires, nobles whispered in hushed tones, uncertain whether to swear fealty to a king who had supplanted his own nephews. Rumours multiplied. Some claimed that the young princes were already dead, their bodies hidden within the silent confines of the Tower. Others held that they still lived, awaiting rescue by loyal Yorkist knights. As days turned to weeks, more disquieting reports emerged. Tower guards spoke in fragments of overheard sobs and muffled pleas beneath the battlements. A servant recalled glimpsing two small figures behind barred windows, their faces pale and hollow. Yet no one was permitted access to confirm their fate. The resulting mystery gave rise to the legend of the Princes in the Tower, a tale of royal innocence betrayed and extinguished by a usurping uncle. Ballads circulated in taverns and market squares, lamenting the loss of hope and decrying the cruelty of Gloucester's ascension. Despite the growing unease, King Richard III moved resolutely to consolidate his reign. He dispatched envoys to the courts of France, Burgundy, and Scotland, seeking recognition of his title. He summoned the young dukes of Yorkist persuasion to swear new oaths of fealty before the first day of July. He even convened a Council of State on the 15th of July to promulgate ordinances confirming land grants and to reassure the gentry that their properties would remain secure under his rule. These measures, however, did little to quell the sense of unrest that rippled through the land. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Woodville and Lord Hastings, having witnessed Gloucester's rise, found themselves increasingly marginalised. They were summoned to the palace under the guise of offering further counsel to the crown, only to discover that their access had been curtailed. Within weeks, Hastings was arrested on charges of plotting with Lancastrian sympathisers. He was brought before the very Star Chamber that Gloucester had empowered, tried without fair defence, and condemned to death. On the 13th day of June, Lord Hastings was executed at Tower Hill, a stark demonstration that the new king would brook no dissent, however noble the source. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond and last surviving Lancastrian claimant, watched these events with grim interest. From his exile in Brittany, he received dispatches detailing the turmoil, and agents were dispatched to England's western ports to gauge the possibility of landing forces to restore the elder prince. Tudor's supporters, emboldened by Gloucester's unpopularity, began to gather in secret enclaves around Milford Haven and Pembroke, hoping that Henry Tudor might lead a rescue expedition for the missing princes. Yet within the narrow confines of Westminster and the Tower, the fate of the young Edward and Richard of York remained sealed behind iron doors. No petition or petitioners were admitted. No sermons could penetrate the hush that surrounded their name. The only certainty was that, once Edward IV had died, the line of succession had shifted forever, and that the once bright promise of two boy kings had been extinguished in the murky politics of a realm bereft of its rightful sovereign. Thus concluded the opening of Richard III's brief and troubled reign. a legal sleight of hand enforced by the weight of the crown, witnessed by a captive nobility, and forever shadowed by the unanswered question of the princes in the Tower. In sleepy corridors of power, where candle flames guttered and distant bells tolled, England stood on the brink of yet another turn in its restless quest for a ruler who could unite its divided heart. Richard III's reign endured scarcely more than 2 years, yet it was marked by constant controversy and the ever-present threat of insurrection. Almost immediately after his coronation, King Richard dismissed a host of ministers who had served Edward IV. Lord Rivers, the late Queen's brother, was stripped of his offices and exiled in the spring of 1483. Sir Thomas Vaughan, Chamberlain to Prince Edward, was arrested on charges of treason and executed at Pontefract in October of that same year. By the end of 1484, no fewer than 17 members of Edward IV's inner circle had either lost their posts or fled the kingdom, their estates sequestered by the crown. Meanwhile, the army that Richard had inherited, once bolstered by Yorkist veterans, fell into disrepair. Pay arrears accumulated to as many as 4 months by mid-1484, and enlistment numbers dwindled from roughly 5,000 men-at-arms under Edward IV to fewer than 3,000 under Richard's command. Many seasoned captains refused to serve, fearing association with a king whose legitimacy was so widely questioned. Even garrisons in the north reported shortages. At Pontefract Castle, provisions meant to last until Michaelmas ran out by the feast of Saints Simon and Jude on the 28th day of October, forcing the governor to ration supplies. All the while, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, and the last surviving Lancastrian claimant, watched from exile in Brittany and then in France. He maintained a network of secret agents across the Channel, who sent regular dispatches about the weakness of Gloucester's regime. By the end of 1484, Tudor had gathered roughly 2,000 men, mostly French infantry paid in gold from King Charles VIII's treasury, and a handful of Breton nobles eager to gain English lands. With these forces, Henry resolved to return to England and end the Yorkist interlude once and for all. On the 7th day of August, in the year 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Mill Bay near Milford Haven, Wales, with an invasion force estimated at 2,500 men. His arrival was timed to coincide with a pilgrimage festival at nearby Haverfordwest, ensuring that local Welsh levies numbering perhaps another 1,000 would join his ranks. Henry's banner, adorned with the Red Rose of Lancaster, flew defiantly as he marched northward into the Marcher territories. King Richard, having received word of Tudor's landing on the 11th of August, mustered his forces at Leicester. By the 19th of August, he had assembled an army of roughly 12,000 soldiers, 3,000 men-at-arms, 5,000 billmen, and 4,000 archers. This host was more than sufficient to confront Tudor's smaller army, but Richard's haste left little time for proper provisioning or reconnaissance. Many of his archers arrived without their longbows, having been delayed by supply wagons stuck in the summer rains. On the 22nd day of August, the two armies met on Bosworth Field, a flat plain near the village of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The weather was overcast, and a light mist clung to the dew-laden grass. Richard's standard bearing the white boar advanced to engage Tudor's ranks. Leading the attack, Richard rode upon a grey horse often misremembered as a white steed and plunged into the Lancastrian centre with his household knights. Historians note that this charge momentarily scattered Tudor's front line, sending soldiers fleeing towards the Humber Brook that ran along the field's northern edge. Yet Richard's bold assault lacked the intended support. His vanguard, having surged too far ahead, found itself isolated as the cavalry wings failed to close in. Simultaneously, Henry Tudor's half-brother, Jasper Tudor, commanded a troop on the left flank and held firm, preventing the Yorkists from encircling the Lancastrian host. Crucially, the Stanley brothers, William Lord Stanley and Thomas Stanley, arrived with their combined force of roughly 3,000 men. Although ostensibly sworn to Richard, they had been promised Henry's hand in marriage to their stepdaughter, and withheld their charge until the battle's tide turned. At a critical moment, accounts vary between midday and the early afternoon. The Stanleys signalled their intervention by raising the Red Rose banner and charging into Richard's only remaining flank. Surrounded, Richard fought fiercely, reportedly slaying the standard-bearer Sir Percival Thirlwall before receiving a fatal blow to the head. Chroniclers record that his horse reared, then stumbled in a marshy patch, leaving the king exposed. Within minutes, Richard was surrounded by Tudor's men and killed in combat. By sunset, the field lay strewn with the fallen, Lancastrian casualties are estimated at between 2,000 and 3,000 dead, including many Welshmen and French mercenaries. Yorkist losses numbered close to 4,000, a testament to the desperate ferocity of the struggle. Tudor's army claimed victory, and Henry Tudor, now the last man standing, dismounted, and was acclaimed King Henry VII by his soldiers on the spot. In the weeks that followed, Henry secured the allegiance of the Stanleys and marched triumphantly into London on the first day of October 1485. There, in the presence of Parliament, he was formally proclaimed king. This act marked the end of the Wars of the Roses, as 2 centuries of Plantagenet rule gave way to the new Tudor dynasty. The once seemingly invincible House of York was no more, and England, exhausted by decades of civil war, at last glimpsed the promise of a more stable reign under Henry's cautious and conciliatory rule. With the clash of arms finally silenced on Bosworth Field, England entered a new chapter under the banner of the Tudor Rose. On the 28th day of January in the year 1486, Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, took to wife Elizabeth of York, daughter of the late Edward IV. She was born on the 2nd day of February in the year 1466, and at the age of 19 she became queen, uniting the rival houses of Lancaster and York in a single dynastic bond. Their union, solemnized in Westminster Abbey, was hailed as the consummation of peace, a single throne upon which both the red rose and the white rose now rested together. This marriage did more than repair lineage. It signified the close of dynastic bloodshed and the dawn of renewed stability. Over the next decade, England's galleys and cogs, rebuilt under Henry's auspices, began to patrol the Channel with greater vigour, laying the groundwork for the maritime power that would flourish under Elizabeth I. The peace secured by Henry and Elizabeth enabled the kingdom to turn inward, fostering the early flowering of what would become the English Renaissance. Scholars, artists and architects, once stifled by civil war, now found royal patronage for new translations, elegant chantries, and the stone facades of merchant houses in London and Bristol. Yet the legacy of the Wars of the Roses endured far beyond the immediate relief of peace. The conflict had exacted a staggering toll. Contemporary chroniclers estimate that between 6,000 and 8,000 combatants perished on the field at Towton alone, and another 2,000 at Barnet, 500 at Stoke, and nearly 1,000 at Bosworth. Tens of thousands more died of wounds, disease, or starvation in the years of uninterrupted strife. Beyond human lives, the national fabric was rent asunder. Castles lay in ruin, trade routes were disrupted, and the very notion of loyalty had been tested to its limits. From the ashes of this turmoil emerged the institutional reforms pioneered under Edward IV, reforms that Henry VII preserved and built upon. The Yeomen of the Guard, first formed in 1485 to protect Edward himself, remained the king's personal watch. Their crimson uniforms, embroidered with the white Tudor rose, became an enduring emblem of royal security. The Court of Star Chamber, strengthened under Edward, continued to function as a swift and formidable tribunal, dispensing justice without the delays and corruption that plagued the common law courts. Star Chamber sessions in London, convened at Durham Place, heard cases of sedition, riot, and official malfeasance, sending clear warnings to would-be rebels that subversion would incur severe penalties. In finance, Henry VII maintained the customs farming system that Edward had refined. Duties on wool, England's principal export in the mid-15th century, were collected under fixed contracts with merchants, ensuring predictable revenue. Ship surveys in port cities were standardized, and regular audits prevented evasion. These measures filled the royal exchequer, allowing Henry to retire certain debts incurred during his struggle for the crown, to support a standing force of mercenary and royal troops, and to underwrite the maintenance of coastal fortifications from Dover to Cornwall. Administratively, the Tudor court adopted Edward IV's balanced approach of mercy and firmness. Those who had opposed Henry's claim were offered pardons if they swore fresh oaths of loyalty, while the most notorious rebel leaders such as Francis Lord Lovell, who had fought at Bosworth, were pursued with equal severity. Lovell's manor at Minster Lovell was seized in 1507, his estates parcelled out to new men who had demonstrated steadfast fidelity. Thus, the message was clear. The new era would not forget the lessons of the past, nor would it tolerate a revival of the fratricidal anarchy that had plagued the nation. Culturally, the union of Lancaster and York under Henry and Elizabeth provided a stable platform from which England could re-engage with continental trends. Flemish tapestries were imported to furnish palaces, Italian humanists were welcomed at Cambridge, and the printing press, introduced by William Caxton in 1476, flourished under royal license. The combined wealth of crown and merchant classes funded translations of classical texts, endowing men like Thomas Linacre and John Colet with the means to study in Italy and bring back new ideas of medicine and pedagogy. By the time Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1588, the Tudor state had come to embody the dual legacy of Richard III's downfall and Edward IV's innovations. The commercial treaties Edward had arranged with Burgundy and Spain paved the way for the naval expeditions of Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, while the Star Chamber's authority underpinned the monarch's ability to govern without recourse to feuding barons. The yeomen of the guard, now numbering closer to 500, stood at the palace gates as reminders that order, once secured by blood, must be preserved by law. Thus, the model established by Edward IV, combining cultural patronage and popular entertainment with strict enforcement of state authority, proved the template for subsequent Tudor rule. Henry VII's careful marriage policies, administrative vigilance, and fiscal prudence built a monarchy resilient enough to steer England through the Reformation, the Armada crisis, and finally into an era where the white rose and red rose had been swept alike from the banners of war, leaving only the Tudor emblem of a new unified kingdom. In the quiet hush after decades of drumbeats, England at last found a lasting peace, one born of hard-won lessons on power, loyalty, and the costs of civil strife. And so, as the last echoes of clashing steel and rallying cries drift into the distance like wisps of mist at dawn, we find ourselves standing on the gentle threshold between history's ironclad reality and the quiet warmth of reflection. The roses once drenched in the deepest reds of battle have long since closed their petals for the night, and the herald's trumpets, silenced by the passing years, now serve only as distant memories in our minds. In their place, we listen instead to the soft sigh of a lullaby wind, carrying across the green fields where once armies gathered, and settling like a tender blanket over the earth. It is here, in this soft hush, that the true message of our tale comes into focus. That power, once forged by rage and ambition, may be tempered by forgiveness. That the bonds of kinship and loyalty, tested in the crucible of war, can yield a peace as lasting as it is fragile. And that even the greatest of divides, red and white, north and south, brother and brother, can be bridged by a single act of compassion or the steady hand of wisdom. For every act of violence, there lay the possibility of reconciliation. For each dagger drawn in anger, there remained the choice to sheathe it in mercy. Let us carry this lesson into the gentle quiet that now embraces us, allowing the images of kings and courtiers, of battlefields strewn with banners, to fade like candles sputtering in a twilight breeze. Feel the tension ease from your shoulders, as if the very stones of Westminster and the timbers of Eltham have dissolved into stars overhead, guiding us toward rest. And as your breathing deepens, steady as the tolling of some distant monastery bell, know that the legacies of those who came before us, both storied and sorrowful, have shaped a world in which we can now find comfort and possibility. Soon, sleep will gather you in its tender arms, carrying you beyond the reach of ambition's shadow into realms of dream where peace reigns unchallenged. And when morning's light returns, it will find you refreshed, armed with the knowledge that even the fiercest conflicts may yield gentle dawns, that hearts once hardened by strife can soften in the glow of understanding, and that every whisper of history holds within it the power to guide us toward a more harmonious tomorrow. So close your eyes now, let the last traces of the day drift away, and rest easy beneath the watchful stars. May your dreams be painted with soft hues of hope and healing, and may the quiet valor of those who endured guide you toward your own gentle triumphs. Good night, dear friend, and if you have found solace in our tale, please remember to subscribe to our channel for more stories whispered in the calm and light of memory stories, to carry you softly into sleep and into the promise of each new day.